In today's video, I will be going over the near-death experience, otherwise known as NDE, as statistical evidence for Christianity. The near-death experience is a very commonly discussed phenomenon today as medical science has improved markedly over the last few decades, and resuscitations of deceased humans are becoming more and more common, especially if somebody is deceased inside a hospital or in the presence of medical personnel. And the body of literature around near-death experiences can be analyzed statistically and be shown to provide very strong evidence in favor of, when you weigh all of the evidence, in favor of Christianity. So let's begin. First of all, we're going to discuss statistical inference. So very briefly, the steps involved in statistical inference are as follows. First, you assume a null hypothesis, H naught. And H naught is typically the opposite of that which you are trying to prove. So in this case, we're trying to prove the veracity or the truth or the validity of near-death experiences. And so we will assume the opposite of that. So we will assume they perhaps are a dream or a hallucination or some other effect produced by the dying brain. So that'll be the null hypothesis. The p-value is defined as the probability of the observed data, and actually more technically correct to say as extreme or more extreme against the null hypothesis as you observe, conditional upon the null hypothesis being true. So you look around, you collect information from people who've had a near-death experience, and you say, okay, what was the probability of seeing all of that, given that given the assumption that their near-death experience was completely false? So that probability is called the p-value. And then if it turns out that probability is very, very low, then you reject H naught because you either got really, really unlucky with your data collection, or more plausibly, you made a mistake in your initial assumption. So H naught is false. You reject it. Now the alpha level, that's the percentage below which you will reject H naught. That varies depending on the research question, depending on the scientific team, depending on some of the real-life implications of making mistakes. So for certain research questions, you want to be extraordinarily confident in your results. But one of the most common is 0.05, and you may have heard, for example, election polls or other types of polls. So they'll talk about, well, such and such percent of people have these feelings about this political party, and that ranges 19 times out of 20 between these two percentages. So you'll hear this 19 times out of 20 often cited, and that's the 0.05 significance level. That effectively means there is a less than 5% chance that you've made a mistake, that in fact the true value is outside of your computed range. Now, when it comes to rejecting a null hypothesis, that you would translate that as saying that there's less than a 5% chance that you have erroneously rejected that null hypothesis. Now, you may have much, much stronger evidence than that. And in fact, as you will see, we do have much stronger evidence than that when it comes to near-death experiences and the veracity thereof. And so highly statistically significant is a p-value less than 0.01. We actually will be discussing and computing vastly smaller p-values than that. So let's now give a sort of broad overview of the evidence for the legitimacy of near-death experiences. So first we're going to be looking at something called mentation, and specifically enhanced mentation. Now enhanced mentation is a fancy way of saying that during a near-death experience, people typically are not sort of cloudy and confused. as you are in a dream, but rather they're extremely clear-headed. And in fact, many times people report that they are far more clear-headed and alert than they've ever been in their entire life. So it's the complete opposite of what you would expect if it's a result of your brain degrading and you're under the influence of some narcotics that they've given you for pain. It's the complete opposite. And so what percentage report enhanced mentation? Well, it's actually a large percentage. So in two separate studies, one of 58 and one of 237 near-death experiences, respectively 72 and 67% reported enhanced mentation. And so that's a very large number. That's respectively almost 3/4 and a little over 2/3. And even more remarkable, in a subsample of 130 of those most close to physical death, it was much higher, not lower. Remember, these people are most close to physical death. You might expect their brains are dying, so everything's more cloudy. No, they're far more alert. 92% of those experienced enhanced mentation. So that is a pretty powerful bit of evidence in favor of the veracity of near-death experiences. Next, we're going to look at out-of-body experience, or OOB. Now, in that study I cited of 237 near-death experiences, 51% had perceived their own physical body, which is otherwise known as an out-of-body experience, or OOB. Now, when you perceive your own body in the real life physical situation where it actually is lying, that's an OOB. On the other hand, if you have a dream that you are in a war and maybe you see yourself lying on the ground during the war and you see yourself deceased. So, about 30 years ago, I had a couple dreams like that when I was an atheist, and for some reason at the time I was kind of more concerned about my mortality than at other times in my life. And I had a couple dreams like that, but they were very cloudy, and the location I was in the dream was nowhere even close to the bedroom where I was actually lying. So that's not an OOB. That's a dream. Out-of-body experience is when you're lying on an operating room table and you're seeing yourself on that table where you actually are. Or maybe your heart stopped in your bed and you're standing beside your body looking down in your own bedroom in your own house. That's an out-of-body experience. And the number of times I've had one of those in my life, and I'm in my 50s now, is 0. And I suggest most people who have not had a near-death experience would also report 0. So the expected frequency out of 237 randomly sampled people who just had a dream last night, and you sample them and you ask them some survey questions about their dreams. And you say, did you dream about seeing your own body in your own bed or on the couch in front of the TV or wherever you fell asleep? And effectively 0% in almost every single sample would say yes to those questions. Now, I'm going to be vastly conservative here. And a conservative when it comes to statistics means you give the opposing side some freebies just to be extra safe that you're not yourself making a mistake or stacking the deck in your own favor. So you're going to bias things against yourself and then still show you have overwhelming evidence in your favor. So that's called a conservative estimate in statistics. So we're going to be conservative here. We're going to assume that it's not 0 out of 237 people on the street, but that 1. So we're going to assume we go to a mall and sample 237 people, and one of them is going to say, you know what? Actually, last night I was standing beside my body on the couch where I passed out, and it was really interesting. I was watching TV and I saw my body lying there. We're going to assume one person said yes to that, which is a vast overestimate. Now, so we now have two samples. We have a sample of people who did not nearly die last night, 237 of those, and we have the study of 237 near-death experiences from the literature. In the one sample, the healthy sample, we're going to give them that 1 out of 237 had an OOB, even though in reality it's probably 0. And from the literature, we know that 51% out of 237 near-death experiences did report an OOB. And we're going to calculate under the null hypothesis that those NDEs were just dreams. What is the probability 51% would have had an OOB as part of that dream? And we compute the probability of observing such a dramatic difference in sample rates. So 51% versus 1 in 237. And we'll do that with something called Fisher's exact test. And when we compute the p-value from Fisher's exact test, we get a p-value equal to 10 to the negative 44. So that's equivalent to having a 0, then a decimal point, then 43 more zeros, and then a 1. So it's an extraordinarily small number. Put in other terms, it's equivalent to winning one of the most difficult lotteries to win, which is called the U.S. Powerball lottery in the United States, which has an odds of 1 in 292 million per draw. And you have to win that not once, twice, 3 times, or even 4 times, but 5 times in a row. And I mean in a row, not in your lifetime. You've got to buy 5 tickets and hit them all. And then you've got your 10 to the negative 44. So it's just overwhelming evidence against the idea that NDEs are just people having dreams. And next we're going to go to the topic about verifiable details. So, and we're going to discuss some specific examples of those next. And generally speaking, what you're going to find is these p-values are all reasonably less than 1 in a billion, and some are much, much less than 1 in a billion. So when we talk about verifiable details or verified details, there's going to be 2 groups that we're going to look at. Let's start with the easier one to try to debunk if you're a skeptic, and that's verified details near to the body. And then after that, we're going to get to verified details far from the body, and then even more extreme than that. But starting with the near to the body examples, each of these stories really, the minimum level of evidence is under 1 in a billion. And it just goes down from there. So that's the weakest evidence you're going to find is extraordinarily strong in these stories. So let's start with the patient of nurse Norma Bowe. So this nurse's patient, a female, she died on the operating table. She reportedly had an OOB, out-of-body experience. And this patient was OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and of course was under enhanced mentation during her OOB. And so she memorized the 12-digit serial number, which was on top of a very large piece of equipment in the OR. Now, when I say large, it was reportedly over 7 feet tall. So nobody, unless they got on a ladder, would have been able to physically get up there and look at this serial number. And most normal people, probably most of the medical personnel in that room, didn't even know that there was a serial number printed on top of this machine. I mean, how many of you have a serial number printed on top of your fridge? You don't know, right? You haven't looked, and most fridges would not have it. So it was just a random thing that there was a serial number placed on top of this machine rather than behind this machine. So this woman, during her out-of-body experience, had been floating up near the ceiling, had looked down, seen this serial number, and just memorized it due to a combination of OCD as well as enhanced mentation. And when she was later on revived, she told the medical personnel, "Oh, wow, you wouldn't believe it. I was on the ceiling. I watched you guys working on me. And I just happened to memorize, a serial number on top of that machine over there." And so nobody in that room knew probably most of them didn't even know there was one, but they got a maintenance guy to get up there with a ladder, and they verified it. She had nailed the 12-digit number. Now, first of all, most people wouldn't know there was a number up there. Secondly, you wouldn't know it was 12 digits long. But even if you did, again, let's be conservative here. So even if you did assume that everyone knew it and they knew it was 12 digits, nailing that 12-digit number still produced with a p-value of 10 to the negative 11, which is equivalent to winning the U.S. Powerball lottery once, but simultaneously guessing the exact birthday of the year of the clerk who sold you the winning ticket. So that's extraordinarily strong evidence against the null hypothesis of NDEs just being a dream. This is evidence in favor of the fact that she really did have a genuine OOB, was genuinely on the ceiling and reading this serial number during her physically deceased, during a time when her body was physically deceased and all the medical personnel were working on her. So that was some very strong evidence. There's another story which we're going to talk about. This is a woman known in the literature as Pam Reynolds. And this was a patient who was really, she was terminal unless they did a very radical surgery on her. So what they did for Pam Reynolds is they purposely stopped her heart for a few hours during surgery. They taped her eyes shut and they inserted earbuds with really loud clicks into her ears. And then they monitored her brain activity. So this was done in order to confirm zero brain activity. So if you've got really loud earbuds stuck in your ears and you're awake or even asleep, you're going to register that and it's going to show up as brainwaves. So that's why they did that. They wanted to make sure she was, and they lowered her body temperature too, so that it wouldn't become damaged during this time while they were doing this radical surgery. Well, during this time, when she was completely deceased in many ways, the Pam Reynolds reported having an out-of-body experience, floating on the ceiling and watching her body in the operating theater. And she observed a couple things. So one was auditory. So she was able to hear a quiet conversation between medical personnel about her vein size. And specifically, one of the medical personnel was kind of a little bit befuddled as to how to get this catheter in place because of her unusually small veins. So they were asking another a doctor or nurse their advice on this. And they were speaking pretty quietly. So you would not have been able to hear this at all if you were wearing earbuds with very loud clicks. But Pam Reynolds didn't report hearing any clicks at all because she was not hearing this from the perspective of her own brain or skull area. She was observing this entire thing from the ceiling of the room. And so she was able to hear this and report it back to them after being resuscitated. So the second thing that Pam Reynolds witnessed was visual. So this was the bone saw that they used to cut into her skull, and it was a very unusual bone saw. She had described it as a combination of an electric toothbrush and some other implement. It was some strange thing, but she was able to describe it in pretty good detail. And the surgeon was, of course, quite impressed because unless you were a brain surgeon, you would not have any knowledge of this particular instrument. So let's produce a p-value from this story. First of all, it's a little hard to quantify a p-value in this particular case, but I think a dramatic underestimate of the significance would be again 1 in a billion, because of all the operations going on in the world at any given time. How many of these involve that particular bone saw, and how many of these involve a quiet conversation between medical personnel about vein size? You know, when you combine those two things, it's got to be easily less than 1 in a billion. So that's where we're going to get that p-value from there. And let's move to the next story. So this one is called The Man with the Dentures. So there was a man who had clinically died, probably en route to the hospital, but he was brought into the ER deceased. They were desperately trying to resuscitate him. And this was an elderly man. He had dentures. And the dentures were getting in the way of the resuscitation efforts. So one of the nurses removed his dentures and didn't know where else to put them. So just quickly, in the panic, threw them into the bottom drawer of a crash cart. And then they managed to resuscitate him and stabilize him. And a couple days later, he was recovering somewhere else in the hospital. And when he came to, the medical personnel had apologized to him and said, "I'm sorry, we seem to have lost your dentures during the hubbub of when you were brought in." And this patient said, "Oh, actually, I know exactly where they are. And not only that, but I know who put them there. And of course, this was later on confirmed. They found the nurse. He said, that's her. She said, oh, you're right. She checked. And yeah, that's right. I did that in my panic. And again, if you want to talk about, and he had observed all of this happening from the ceiling of the ER. He'd watched everyone, scrambling around, and he had seen the nurse do this from the perspective, obviously, outside his body. And again, the p-value is going to be easily less than 1 in a billion. I mean, he came in deceased, so he wouldn't even have known about the existence of a crash cart. I wouldn't have known that there even would be a crash cart. And then he's got to pick the right nurse, and then he's got to pick what drawer it got put in. So, and all of this while he was not only unconscious, but literally dead. And so the idea that he could have known all of this from his physical mind is virtually impossible, and is very strong evidence for the veracity of his OOB. Again, under 1 in a billion in my estimate. And then the last example we're going to go to with near to body verified details is a patient named Al Sullivan. So Al Sullivan had reported during his OOB, when he had passed away in the operating room, observing the surgeon flapping his arms weirdly like a bird, like almost like a child would put his hands in his armpits and then flap like his elbows like wings. And when he was resuscitated, he later on mentioned that. And he said, yeah, I mean, why were you doing that? He asked the surgeon. And the surgeon said, yeah, I was doing that. And in fact, that was that surgeon's way of pointing to things around the operating room in order to avoid contaminating his already scrubbed hands, because he was afraid if he's pointing at things, he's going to touch somebody else with his hands and have to keep rescrubbing and rescrubbing. So this was a little somewhat unusual habit this particular surgeon had, and he did confirm it. And again, this was an OOB, and Al Sullivan had observed this, again, from the ceiling of the operating room. And again, this is hard to quantify via p-value. I don't know if the percentage of surgeons who do that is 1 in a billion, but it's a very unusual thing to even suggest. So I think if it was just a guess, then I think reasonably, again, that's going to be a 1 in a billion. But that one maybe is a little harder to quantify. So that's some pretty strong evidence from verified details near to the body. Now, the evidence when we start talking about verified details far from the body gets even stronger. Because if you observe something near to the body, somebody could always say, well, maybe your brain was still like so slightly conscious you were able to observe this stuff even though you were virtually dead. Now that, of course, is ridiculous, because if as you get tired, your ability to observe things goes down close to zero. If you've ever been a university student pulling all-nighters, your brain stops working, but if they put you in a brain scan, it would appear highly, highly active. So the idea that when your brain is virtually dead, somehow you're observing all this stuff, it definitely doesn't pass the smell test. But even so, sure. Let's not even argue with that, because the body of literature we're going to get to next, which is verified details far from the body, renders that particular skeptical hypothesis absolutely logically impossible at that point. So the first story we're going to get to is a patient in Hartford, Connecticut. So there's a hospital there called Hartford Hospital, or there was, and this patient had died in the hospital and had an out-of-body experience. Now during this experience, they left the hospital. They left the operating or hospital room during the resuscitations and began to move upwards, and eventually exited the hospital through the roof, but moving pretty slowly, and looked down at the roof and saw randomly a red tennis shoe just sitting there on the roof. Now that's an unusual thing to see on the roof, so it would make sense you would notice that. And so when they were resuscitated, they mentioned that to the medical personnel. They said, wow, I was out of my body. And by the way, there's a red tennis shoe on the roof randomly. And there was a skeptical employee who had roof access who decided to go up there and try to disprove this. And when they went up there, they in fact found this random red tennis shoe that maybe some teenagers had thrown up there at one point. You know how sometimes you see shoes hanging on wires and things. So maybe that had happened here. But they did find a red tennis shoe up there. Now, again, hard to precisely quantify the p-value here, but I'm going to posit it's going to be 1 in a billion. If you look at all of the hospitals on Earth, you say how many of them have a red tennis shoe on top of them? It's probably one in the entire world. So, I mean, it's probably 1 in a billion, that particular p-value. And let's move to the next story. So there's a social worker named Kimberly Sharp who had a patient. And her patient, a woman, had died of a heart attack and was revived in hospital. Now, while she was deceased, during the resuscitation efforts, this patient had had an OOB. And during the OOB, she had observed details about the resuscitation process. So she had seen it taking place. And then, like in the similar story, she then left the room and began to float upwards. And in this case, she was floating upwards just outside the hospital. And so she was looking at all the windowsills as she went up. And a few stories up, she noticed, actually it was another shoe, but in this case it was a dark blue tennis shoe, and with a wear mark over the little toe. And so she had been floating very close and slowly up next to these windowsills. So she got a really clear look at this shoe. And she was able to describe it as well as the wear marks on it. And this was, again, sitting on I believe it was reported to be a 3rd-story ledge of the hospital as she had floated upwards. And this was later on verified by the social worker, who verified that, yes, the shoe was there, the color was right, and even the wear marks were correct. And she said that those particular wear marks could not even have been observed from inside the hospital. If you'd looked through the window and seen it, you had to have been outside the hospital floating in midair to have seen it at that, and really close to it at that particular angle. So again, this is hard to quantify, but quite reasonably that's going to be a 1 in a billion for similar reasons to the red tennis shoe story. And then finally, we'll do one more story with the far from body OOBs before we move on to the next section. So this 3rd story is a patient named Laura Gaines. Her heart had been stopped during surgery, and she had reported having an out-of-body experience while she was deceased. So first she was viewing her body in the operating theater, and then somehow she floated through the wall outside of the operating room and happened to see her mother sitting in a chair in the hallway outside the waiting area. And so her mother, I guess when she'd gone into surgery, was in the waiting area. But when things had taken too long and the doctors had expressed they were concerned whether or not Laura was going to make it, the mother was quite distraught and had been moved into a more private area onto a chair inside an empty hallway near the waiting area. So this is a random place where she would have seen her. And but yeah, she did see her mother there. And that was later verified. So again, probably 1 in a billion. I mean, how many people having surgery, their mothers just randomly are moved and placed by themselves in a hallway somewhere? It's going to be extraordinarily rare occurrence to just tell the personnel, yeah, I saw this, and it turns out it was correct. So that was indeed some pretty strong evidence. We can get even stronger than that, or at least similarly strong. So next up, we're going to look at NDEs with verified knowledge of other deceased people. So we're just going to talk about one particular example here, although there are many other examples. But the one example we're going to look at here is a patient named Jack Bybee. And this patient had died of pneumonia in a South African hospital, had an NDE, during which he had met the daughter of the deceased daughter of one of the nurses who was working on him. And this daughter had told him that could he pass on the message to her mother that she was sorry she had wrecked the family's MGB. So MGB, I guess, is a kind of a fairly, not super exotic, but a nice car. It was the family's nice car. And this daughter had gotten in a car accident and died in that car accident and wrecked the car. So randomly, she asked him to just say sorry she wrecked the MGB and also pass on that she loved her mother, of course. And so when Jack Bybee was revived and he told the nurse this, she was shocked and apparently ran out of the room and very distraught because it was true. Her daughter had died recently, wrecked the family MGB, and that was verified. And so, I mean, sticking with the 1 in a billion, we can say it's less than 1 in a billion. It's probably much, much less than 1 in a billion, that particular story. And that's something that this guy would have no reason or no logical way of knowing outside of being informed by the daughter. So that is some extremely strong evidence as well. So all of these are very strong evidence of the veracity, the truth of NDEs as something other than a hallucination or some sort of a dream. That in fact they are in fact evidence of the soul existing beyond the physical body and outside of and away from the physical body, and even visiting a realm with other people who have already passed away in the past. So next up, we're going to discuss 2 categories of near-death experiences that go beyond the OOB. So the out-of-body experience is what generally happens initially. So when somebody passes away very briefly and then they're quickly resuscitated, usually their experience doesn't go beyond the out-of-body experience. They're quickly brought back into their body as their body starts to function again. However, if somebody passes away for a longer period of time, then they begin to float away from their body and they are eventually taken in a couple different possible directions. So one possible direction is upwards and in a very positive direction. So these NDEs are called positive NDEs, and they are also considered by some to be or called heaven testimonies. And effectively, a large proportion, I would say the majority of NDEs that do progress beyond the initial OOB tend to involve a tunnel with brilliant light and love, reported meetings with God, and a large proportion of those specifically report meeting Jesus. Those encountering Jesus during their NDEs describe his unconditional love and compassion well beyond what is possible between humans. So not even parents' children come close, is what people often report. And people are left with impressions of Jesus's immense power coupled with his unparalleled gentleness and eternal wisdom. And some third-party anecdotal evidence also exists whereby people who have not had an NDE, but they've been near a dying person, have seen and heard that dying person, who's usually a Christian, reaching out in joy as they're nearing death towards unseen loving spirits. And that is evidence that they are starting to see into the spiritual realm as they near physical death, along with additional implications involving their probable salvation. One example of that is historically is somebody named Lady Glenorch. She was a missionary from Scotland who had reportedly said just before passing away, "If this is dying, it is the pleasantest thing imaginable." And you can search for Christians' last words for many more comforting examples of what it's like to die while knowing God. And of course, these heaven testimonies and positive NDEs and third-party anecdotal evidence do provide support and evidence in favor of Christianity from the positive side of Scripture. That being said, while a substantial portion of NDEers do not claim to have met Jesus during their NDE, we can nevertheless find evidence supporting Christianity from this other less discussed side, namely that of hell. Remember, Jesus warned often of hell. So while most reported NDEs are positive, 25%, give or take, depending on the source, of reported NDEs are negative, and that involves demons and or visits to hell itself. One could consider this an underestimate, since people will be less prone to share negative NDEs. Thus, a large proportion of NDEs appear to involve descents into hell, and the reported characteristics of hell are consistent with each other across NDE stories, as well as consistent with the Bible, providing further corroboration of Christianity from the perspective of those who reject Christ. In fact, if no NDEs involved hell or demons, it might cast a shadow of doubt onto the Bible for those of lesser faith, because, as you know as a Christian, hell is real. Those experiencing hell during their NDE describe multiple layers, which include outer darkness, described as utter permeating blackness coupled with extreme fear and loneliness. Beneath that, stone-walled caverns filled with torture chambers for the damned. And beneath that, some describe a lake of fire. Many NDEers have described consistent aspects, including the aforementioned structures, tortures causing unimaginable pain, yet which do not kill the soul, and the extreme hatred of the demons inflicting suffering on the human souls therein. Those who came back from hell either did so via physical resuscitation by doctors or by calling on the name of Jesus in order to be pulled from hell. The former include atheists lucky enough to get a second chance to know God while on earth, while the latter include past or lukewarm Christians with just enough relationship with the Lord to be able to call on his name successfully. Most in hell are not so fortunate, as evidenced by those returning, describing billions of souls suffering below. Now, just as with the positive NDEs, we also can find anecdotal third-party testimonies of those who were dying, which are consistent with the negative NDEs. So some third-party anecdotal evidence exists whereby people have seen and heard a dying person, usually an atheist or extreme evildoer, recoiling and screaming in terror at unseen demonic spirits as the patient nears physical death. That is, again, evidence of starting to see into the spiritual realm as one nears physical death, with, in this case, additional implications involving probable damnation. One example involved a hospice nurse watching a gang member patient die. This patient had rejected Jesus in violent and profane terms while in hospice in response to his mother witnessing to him. In the last minute of his physical life, the gang member patient turned his head and focused on something no one else could see and said, "Oh shit, oh no." And you can search for famous atheists' last words for many more terrifying examples of what it is like to die without knowing God. So putting all of this together, from the statistical evidence combined with the anecdotal evidence, Christianity is the undeniable conclusion. Now, you know as a Christian that you should not require evidence in order to believe in Jesus and accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. In fact, it's well known that Jesus has a special place in his heart for those who believe without seeing. However, if the evidence that does exist in the world can be packaged together in such a way that it can bring more sheep to the fold, particularly the scientific skeptical atheists, then I think that is a wonderful thing. And we're going to go to some scripture here, which I think helps to corroborate that. This is a quote from Jesus Christ himself, taken from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 7, verses 7 to 8. Ask, and it shall be given you. Seek, and ye shall find. Knock, and it shall be opened unto you. For every one that asketh receiveth, and he that seeketh findeth, and to him that knocketh it shall be opened. Next month, we're going to cover another topic. I try to cover about one topic per month, often from the scientific atheist perspective, as I was for much of my life, as well as from the born-again Christian perspective, as thankfully I am now. And I hope you can join me next time. Thanks for watching Evidentiary Christianity. If you want to help support us via Bitcoin, that's our Bitcoin address right there. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.